Okay, thank you. Welcome to the first We Are Change Leeds meeting of 2014. We're very happy to have Janine Griffiths, who's going to give the talk this evening. Just to tell you a little bit about Janine, she is an investigative journalist who has worked in the industry for over 8 years now. She started out as a newspaper reporter in the West Midlands before finally moving to Leeds to work on behalf of a financial news agency. She's also worked on short projects for The Guardian during her career. Shortly after moving to Leeds in 2009, due to her disillusionment over the quality of journalism and the mainstream media, she started up the Akashic Times. Janine has witnessed firsthand the corruption with the mainstream media and how facts, statistics and situations are manipulated in order to play into the hands of the corporate entities and political sellouts that have a vested interest in maintaining and expanding the status quo. The frustration of having stories censored and witnessing the shady dealings with both the local and national media led her to finalist decision to start up the Akashic Times. Please give Janine a round of applause.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Carol for that wonderful introduction. Okay, so tonight I'm just going to talk a little bit about who I am, why I started out the Akashic Times, and just give a bit of an insight into my background as a reporter. But first, before I begin, can I just check, can everyone hear me at the back?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so I first became a journalist because I like to write, and also I was very frustrated at the censorship and lies that passes for news nowadays. So as mentioned, I've been in the industry for around about 8 years now, and from a very early age, I mean even before I became a reporter, it became clear to me how the media could divide people and cause tension in society. I mean, I grew up in a place called Dagenham, and I'd often hear a lot of my friends and a lot of the people I knew sort of talk in a very sort of negative way about communities that they weren't familiar with, and immigrants in particular. And when I ask people, okay, well, why do you think that? Where do you get these views from? Often I'd hear people say, well, you know, I mean, it's all over the news, it's all in the newspapers, or sometimes, oh, well, it's just, you know, I was brought up to think like this. So we can really see how the media can influence whole generations of people. However, I was naive enough to think that, okay, well, you know, I see the problems with the mainstream media, but how do we sort of change this? How you can change it from the inside, because that's what people do, isn't it? You know, like they see a problem and they work with it to get it changed. Well, I had my first taste of reality when I worked for the Shropshire Star Group, and I was working on a paper called the Telford Journal. The mayor's wife had approached our paper basically with evidence that he was not only pilfering money from public funds and siphoning it off into his own business, he'd also been quite violent towards her. There was a lot of domestic violence going on. Now, I was one of 2 reporters working on the Telford Journal, which is part of the Shropshire Star, and I was the one who picked up the story. And just to give you a bit of background into how it all worked, on the Telford Journal we were always under pressure to come up with front page stories. Every single week we'd be told, you've got to find us a front page, you've got to find us a front page, you know. It worked under this kind of target system. So I thought this would make a brilliant splash, and I spent 6 months on the job investigating the story. Putting in various Freedom of Information Acts, getting people to trust me, getting people to talk, and examining the evidence for myself. And after 6 months, I had a pretty good story together. This is something that could not only have really caused debate in Telford, but beyond that as well, nationally. Only to be called into the editor's office, not the editor of the paper I was on, the editor of the overall group, to be told, you know, we really love your skills as a journalist. You've really, you know, come into your own, and we're impressed with your progress. Unfortunately, we won't be publishing this story. And when I asked why, I was told, well, the mayor, his businesses, it's one of our biggest advertisers, and we'd lose a lot of political contacts. Needless to say, I wasn't very happy with that outcome, and it prompted me to do more research into the ownership of the media and later on the Masons, because what I couldn't understand is, okay, yes, I get how one group of papers can be influenced to such an extent on a local level. What I didn't really get is some of the other papers, our competition who I tried to flog the story to, didn't seem to be that interested either, and they all kind of gave similar reasons if they came back to me at all. And essentially what I discovered is we have a really big problem on our hands with the media, not just in this country, but all over the world. You see, when you have a situation where the likes of Barclays Bank, Rupert Murdoch and ex-KGB agents have ownership of the media, then you realise why scandals such as the Leveson inquiry are routinely swept under the carpet. And
sorry about this.
yeah, you see, then you realise why scandals are routinely aren't examined in detail. I'd say you hear of them, but they're kind of brushed aside after a while. Or why editors of national newspapers, I won't name any names, i.e. the Daily Mail, for example, are allowed to sit on the board of the Press Complaints Commission, which is a clear conflict of interest. It explains basically why you can never really trust what you read in the papers. I mean, why is it that we get a situation where the antics of Miley Cyrus or Justin Bieber or whatever celebrity you can sort of pull out of a hat makes the front page news, while the content of the Bilderberg meetings and sort of elite paedophile rings, which is just only starting to gather pace in terms of exposure, barely get a look in by the mainstream media. You see, I never really understood this in as much detail until recently, fairly recently I would say, because, you know, we're often led to believe that when you start exploring these things, it's just a wild conspiracy theory, until you start researching for yourself and you find out that actually there's a lot of truth to it. As I say, I was very naive before I became a journalist. You know, I just believed that, you know, the media, they're really the watchdogs of society. You know, especially the British media, it's kind of held up as this bastion of truth and a kind of neutral voice. You know, if something goes wrong in politics, if something goes wrong with the police force, then at least you've got a voice, then at least you can expose this. And what I found out is that really does not reflect reality. You see, the media is just another system, and like all of the other systems that we have, like the police force, politics, the banking institutions, it's one that serves the 1% and encourages the other 99% to be at each other's throats, or even more crucially, to act against their own self-interest, i.e. by voting for restrictions on financial safety nets and turning a blind eye to political injustice. And I think it's the great Martin Luther King that once said, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And as we see our civil liberties slowly being confined to the historical dustbin, if we allow it, then unfortunately we are experiencing the receiving end of that wisdom. Now, I don't see that it has to be that way. I see that it's definitely sort of time to stand up and fight, even if it just means getting back your self-empowerment, shall I say. So I decided to start the first stages of that fight back, not just for my future, but, you know, if I decide to have any children, their future as well, and by starting up the Akashic Times. along with many other things. But this is one of the main ways that I try to get the information out there. And I believe that as the years go on, this will only get bigger. I mean, we're already seeing the rise of the alternative media. So my aim at the Akashic Times is simply to fill a gap within the media. I mean, at the moment, I'd say that our collective media agencies, both nationally and internationally, is a laughing stock. It's a joke. And unfortunately, the joke's on us. You see, if you were a regular consumer of the rubbish that passes for the mainstream news, which I doubt many people in here are, but for those that are, you know, they can almost be forgiven for thinking that people are just helpless souls that, you know, really need the strong arm of the law and the government to, you know, tell us what to do and to protect us, as they're always claiming. You could almost be forgiven for believing most of the pervading populist ideals and concepts that simply aren't true. You see, it's a question of ownership. When I talk about ownership of the media, when I talk about how the media influences our perceptions, I'm really talking about ownership of the mind, because that's what it all comes down to. It's ownership of the way that we think, of the decisions that we make on a daily basis based upon the information that's coming to us. And for anybody who doubts the power of the mainstream media, I just say, ask yourself a few questions. Ask, why is it that people still vaccinate their kids? Why does racial division and tension seem to be increasing in a lot of places rather than decreasing? Why do people sit idly by, almost in a kind of vacuum, while everything that we slave day in, day out for is slowly being kind of whittled away by whatever party comes in? I mean, I certainly don't pay attention to what I call politics that much anymore, because it's just two sides of the same coin. I mean, isn't it just curious? You know, I kind of look around me and I see a lot of people sometimes as I'm out and about that tend to know the ins and outs of their favourite characters on EastEnders. But you ask them what's going on in real life and they just couldn't tell you, even in their own lives sometimes. So why is that? And that's kind of the question that I put out there. See, my aim at the Akashic Times can be summarised as not just waking people up. I say there's plenty of people out there who are already awake. It's about sort of getting up. It's like, you know, if I wake up in the morning, that's great, you know, it's good, it's a start. But if I don't get up and do something, then I may as well go back to sleep. And this is the analogy that I use here. So I aim to get people fired up enough and passionate enough to take action. Whether that's, I don't mean necessarily going out there on the picket lines or, you know, with banners and protesting. I mean, sometimes that is part of it. I mean, I'm talking about self-empowerment. I'm talking about knowledge of self, taking control of your own health, rather than just just taking in what's given to you. There's many different aspects to this, as I kind of will go into a little bit later. So my aim is to inspire people as well. It's why on the Akashic Times I've got an inspirational news section, because we don't get a lot of that in the media. We get a lot of trauma-based mind programming. We get a lot of these horrible, dark, negative stories. And when we get an influx of that, when we get an excess of that, what you're dealing with is energy. You're dealing with negative energy that is being fed to us through the medium of the media. Well, my aim is to kind of change that. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's important for us to be informed about what's going on. It is very vital that we do know, like, what's happening around us, but only from the standpoint that we are empowered to do something about it. And sometimes I do feel a real kind of urgency and a real passion about this issue. And the reason for that is, as much as I hate to be the bearer of doom and gloom, which I don't believe in incidentally, I simply don't see the current system in which we live as being very sustainable under the present circumstances. You see, I can't help but get the feeling that we don't have an awful lot of time left, especially as the powers that be appear to be sort of tightening their grip. in a number of different ways. And for those who doubt this, let me just put out a few questions. Why is it that we have a situation where cops, predominantly in the US, are carrying out body cavity searches in public, on the streets, on a regular basis? Why is it that citizens are now being subject to these type of invasive searches up to 14 hours in some cases? And where, in fact, I'd say, where was the outcry when these perverted powers were introduced in the first place? And just on that point, what we have to realise is this: when you're dealing with the politicians and some of the governments that we have in the West, and when you realise that too many of those people, I'd say, I can't put a number on it yet, but too many of those people are involved in these kind of paedophile or sex scandals, all of this other stuff makes sense. And why is it that our government only last year passed a law which allows both civil and criminal cases to be tried in absolute secrecy in some cases? That was with the Justice and Security Act. Basically, essentially, what it can mean is, for example, you don't necessarily have to be told that there's a trial taking place against you. You don't have to be told why the judge came to the decision that they came to, and you can be restricted in the kind of lawyers that you are that are allowed to represent you. All of this in the name of anti-terrorism. And how many people are aware, for example, that there's a bill making its way through Parliament now? It's not been passed, and if there's enough of an outcry, it won't be, which is the National Service Bill, which basically wants to bring back national service. All of these are just a slight indication of what kind of world we can expect to live in, and what kind of things we can be subjected to if the elites have their way. By the way, I hate using the word elites because I don't see them as being very superior at all. I'm just referring to the people at the top echelons of the food chain. And as we all know, scum has a tendency to rise to the top, and that's how I think of these people. See, what I would say is, when we're being pushed, when we're being engineered towards something, we have to ask what, why, and how much longer, and whose interest does it serve? The same with the media. Whose interest does it serve? I mean, otherwise, if we don't continue to ask these questions, question everything that we hear, whether it's alternative or not, then the consequences could be fatal. I mean, we've seen this already with war in other countries. We've seen this with people killing each other over money, soaring crime rates, and extremist groups. And by the way, I'd say the biggest extremist group going is the one which controls the banks. It's the one which I say controls politics and almost every public institution that you can think of. And I haven't even touched really upon geoengineering and all the stuff that's going on with that. See, many people sort of will wonder how all of these different things can come to be. How can it be organised by such a small group of people? It's organised from a place of complicity. Basically, people in a way are sort of compliant with it without knowing so, because they're not informed, they're not given that information. I mean, in many states, we see it's illegal, that's in the US that is, to collect rainwater. Same in developing countries. Not all developing countries, but you know, in certain places in Asia, it's illegal to collect rainwater, even though there are severe water shortages. We see companies like Nestle trying to patent natural cures. And why is this? Why do we see these things? Because somebody has claimed ownership over it. But it's also important not to forget that this can only continue if people allow it. I mean, we're often told that we live in a democracy, and the definition of democracy, I'd argue, has been kind of tampered with a little bit. Nowadays, it almost seems to mean mob rule, and when I talk about mobs, I'm sure as hell not referring to the masses. I'm talking about the mobs that have quite arbitrarily decided that they should be our masters and that our lives should kind of revolve around them. But what in actual fact that we should be aiming for is a democratic republic where the equal rights of everybody are enshrined under the law as a natural God-given fact. I mean that's the society, that's the picture that I have when I think of a democracy or a democratic republic. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with people owning mansions and, I don't know, 5 jumbo jets and amassing great swaths of wealth. I don't have a problem with that. I just say leave me out of it. I say don't try to restrict my life so that you can have that. And that's the standpoint which I believe we should all be coming from. But then that's the opinion that I have as a journalist and somebody who researches the way these people tend to work. But all of this is made worse by the fact that we kind of put up with it in the first place because we're told to. You see, the trouble is, when you get to realise that the same people who control the system also control the media, then you've got a very big problem on your hands. And the vast majority of people, not everybody, but a lot of people in our society, are taught to believe what they read in the media because it's seen as a kind of authority, and we tend to put our trust in authorities, in these credible, reputable sources. This is the way we're kind of entrained to think. And when that news turns into propaganda, it can have deadly consequences, even on a local level where you have different groups at each other's throats, as I sort of alluded to earlier. When you have papers, I use the word newspapers quite a lot, but I'm talking about the wider media, also news stations and other outlets where we get our information from. You have fear stories about different groups of people all the time, and it can be anyone really. The enemy changes on an almost daily basis. But this is always used to justify tyranny. And as we see with the Iraqi invasion, evasion is the agenda, but as we've seen with that conflict, division plus racism plus fear equals war or equals conflict. And this is the situation which we find ourselves in. They often say if you repeat something often enough, it will be believed, no matter how ridiculous the lie. It harks right back to Hitler's lie theory. And we've seen that in action in a variety of different ways. One of the most recent examples of that actually is the Gareth Williams case. Does anybody remember hearing the story about the MI5 or MI6 spy who died recently? Basically, the inquest came to the conclusion that he committed suicide, somehow managed to get himself into a hold-all bag, zip the bag up, lock it from the outside and put himself in a bath. Now I'd say that's an extraordinary skill to have, but unfortunately people seem to either believe this stuff or again it's just kind of gently put to one side. And this is what you get with the media. It bombards us with these kind of images, this kind of negativity, because as people we naturally seek for the solutions. We want this madness to stop, and they're only too glad to give us those solutions. It goes back to the Hegelian dialectic as well, which goes something like this: the human mind cannot understand something unless it's split into two polar opposites, so we're told. That good, evil, right, wrong, that kind of stuff. Or to use modern day examples, Labour, Conservative, Communism, Capitalism, rich, poor, enemies, allies, and on it goes. The ways that it is used to kind of separate us from the truth, but most of all separate us from ourselves. See, propaganda is it's nothing new. Even the techniques used in propaganda, aka divide and rule, it's nothing new. It's quite boring actually, but the reason it works so effectively is because it's simply manipulated or modified slightly to make it relevant to our particular brand of oppression, to make it more appropriate to the struggles that we find ourselves in today. John F. Kennedy once said, no matter how big the lie, repeat it often enough and the masses will regard it as the absolute truth. And Lysander Spooner said, those who are capable of tyranny are capable of perjury to sustain it. While Eric Hoffer followed that up with, propaganda does not deceive people. It merely allows people or helps people to deceive themselves. So how does the media help to facilitate this and all of the other sort of deadly consequences that we see on a daily basis? Well, it helps to facilitate war and bloodshed, firstly by promoting it. Consider the recent examples we've had over Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. I mean, you can name quite a few conflicts. And consider the biggest war of all, which is the war on terror. That old chestnut has been used to describe almost every conflict since the 2003 Iraqi invasion, and it's still going on. You see, and just on a side note there, when we talk about the war on terror, are we talking about terror as in, you know, the fear and the horrible things that you go through, or are we talking about terror, which is T-E-R-R-A? See, terror also just happens to be another word for earth. So in the context of this, what are they really saying when they speak about the war on terror? The war on terror has taken away almost every freedom that we can think of, whether that's freedom of speech, freedom of movement. I mean, why is it that we can barely travel through an airport nowadays without being hit by intrusive body scanners, searches, and the Spanish Inquisition in a lot of cases? I mean, why is it that the right to fair trial, i.e. the Justice and Security Bill, has been kind of slowly put to one side? Now that's mainly with terrorism cases, as the government has explained it, but the dangerous thing is it sets a precedent. The right to be free from torture or arbitrary arrest, just your rights to have dignity as a human being. In America, even the freedom to grow your own food has been obliterated with the Senate Bill S510. It's not always enforced, but it's there in the background. In other words, those who hold more than 7 days' worth of food, grow it in the wrong place, can potentially be considered suspicious. And one of the most insidious effects on the war on terror is it's effectively eroded the freedom to think. We are, of course, free to think what we like. I mean, we can think beyond the paradigms that we're given, but if we do choose to exercise that choice in all of its expressions, then that is yet another freedom that can be snatched from us arbitrarily. So I hold that, you know, this war on terror, these wars that we see going on all over the place, was first declared by the media. But before I get into all of that, I'm just going to speak a little bit about what I mean by war. You see, war is defined as an organised and often prolonged conflict that is carried out by states or non-state actors. It is generally characterised by extreme violence, social disruption and economic destruction. And this is exactly what we see with the war on terror. And the real problem is war can be on many different levels. You know, I mean, I hate to be to continue to speak about war, but it's important for us to understand this, because if you understand the problems, then you can understand how to get out of it, then you can understand the solutions. So it started initially with spiritual warfare, that's with religious indoctrination in the past. Now, I'm sort of not against people having whatever religious beliefs they have, but the church as an institution was set up primarily almost as a form of government. Again, it's about controlling the mind, to control what people think and how they see the world, then you've got overall control of the population. Nowadays we see that spiritual warfare, you know, separating ourselves, basically separating us from ourselves. You see a load of sort of fake gurus, you see the censorship of occult material on the internet coming through with certain content filter laws that David Cameron is trying to push through at the moment. Then of course we have the financial woes, you know, like most of us are in some type of debt, and physical ones, as we see with certain type of conflicts. But most of all, perhaps one of the most insidious wars of all, is the attack on the human mind. You see, our emotions are bombarded with trauma-based news, military technologies, which can also influence our thoughts and emotions. Now, this is something that when I first heard about this stuff, I thought, you know what, it just sounds very wacky, it just sounds a bit silly until you kind of do scientific research into this stuff and hear, you know, really prominent people in the sector talking about how this stuff is introduced and is very real. And then you've got plain old media propaganda, which is designed to induce hatred and pull at the heartstrings. So that's why you get all these stories in the paper sometimes of, you know, heroic soldiers sort of coming back and greeting their kids or their little ones and receiving sort of hero's welcome, so to speak. All of it is kind of training your mind in a particular direction. So how else does the media promote this? Well, firstly by sort of glamorising conflict and encouraging young men to sign up in particular. Every year around Remembrance Day, for example, you'll barely see a presenter who doesn't wear a poppy, and if you do, if somebody kind of says, you know what, I'm just going to choose not to wear that, they often get castigated. In many cases, it's a requirement of the job. Then you get, every so often, they'll drive home sort of that message with sort of snapshots of terrible conflicts, terrible dictators in remote parts of the world that a lot of people may not have heard of, and how we need to go in there for the protection of the people. It's funny when they talk about protection, because I see that excuse being used a lot. But it's not just the media, incidentally, while I'm on the subject. It's not just newspapers and, you know, sort of outlets like ITV or the BBC. It's also bolstered by Hollywood, or what is also known as Holy Rod. Holy Rod goes back to the occult origins of the film industry, and that's all about sort of controlling energy, controlling the mind in that sense. For example, military stealth jets appear in films such as Man of Steel, and in the adaptation of Superman and Iron Man and the Transformers. In fact, Phil Strub, who is the Pentagon's Hollywood liaison officer, was recently caught boasting in an interview with Danger Room about how the Pentagon actually commissions films that promote warfare. Interestingly, they don't really commission films that show the harrowing realities of warfare. They don't really like that too much. And one of the films that they sponsored was X-Men First Class, and they fully commissioned The Act of Valor, which was recruiting propaganda disguised as a fun movie. Essentially, what they do, one of the ways that they do this, is to place the latest weapons, which they try to make look really cool and really macho usually, alongside these fictional superheroes who rush in and save the day. And it usually has, you know, the typical pretty woman involved. And is it a coincidence? Let me just kind of leave you with this on this topic. That the release of Top Gun in 1986, after that film was put out there, recruitment figures for the military increased by 500%. This is documented and even reported in papers such as the Washington Post. I mean, I don't have much love for the Washington Post, but you do sometimes see these things come out in the mainstream as well as the alternative media. And this is why I encourage people to read everything, read the stuff not just that you like, but read the stuff that you don't like, to get the full picture of what's going on. Read but don't believe. This is what I always say. This is the standpoint which I come from, because sometimes this information is disseminated, it's just not there in full. I mean, even with movies like The Hunger Games tries to downplay the horrific realities of children being sent into war, and it also plays into the agenda of recruiting more women too. So in addition to that, what we've also got is effectively the war of the mind, which is facilitated financially. You see, this is another thing which the media indirectly encourages. What do I mean when I say financial war? Well, most people today, as I mentioned before, are in some kind of debt, whether that's a student debt, a mortgage, a credit card bill, or a tax bill. Sometimes we're hit with tax bills even if we don't actually owe anything. some of us are kind of obligated to the system in some way. And just to add to the confusion and the way in which we think about debt, the way in which we think about credit, is they switch the words around. So for example, when we want to obtain a card that allows us to buy things with the bank's money, it's known as a credit card. When we want to buy things with our own money, it's known as a debit card. If you take away the I, you get a debt card. The ordinary meaning of the word credit is to have money, not to borrow it from the bank. Whereas the debt kind of explains itself. How many of us know, for example, that if we were to take out, I get a bit technical here, but this is just to explain how this stuff works and how they get us. If we were to take out a loan of £3,000 at 20% APR, which is, and made the minimum repayment of either 2% or £5 a month, whichever is more, it would take us 90 years to pay the whole thing back. And that's when you add the interest rate on top of that as well. Bearing in mind that 20% is less than the national average, which comes in at 29%. And yet loan firms such as Wonga, for example, are typically charging people around 4,214% APR. So to put it in layman's terms, if you were to take a loan of £300 at the minimum repayment, you'd never ever pay that back in your lifetime if you just made the minimum repayment. But people are encouraged to do that because it's easier. So what are we to make of the fact that Wonga are now advising, ironically, the government on how to deal with consumer debt in the UK? This, people, is the same technique that the banking cartels use to get not only individuals but whole nations into debt that simply can never be repaid. So who are we in debt to? You see, it's often said that he who lends is the master, while he who borrows is a slave. And that's just one aspect of the financial turmoil and confusion that many of us find ourselves in today. The other side of that is to keep us working for most of our adult lives, so that we never have time to worry about the bigger picture. We don't really have a lot of time on our hands to be organised and to be protesting, to do all of these different things. We're essentially giving our energy into the very system that is holding us down. And that is what it amounts to. Energy, all of this points to one thing. It's not about sort of finance per se. It's about power, it's about control of the population, and this is how they do it. So with rising debts, energy bills and all this other stuff, people are constantly beholden to this. But then you have images portrayed in the media, and this kind of gets back to the role of reporters and journalists, of the latest celebrity must-have. You've got iPods, iPhones, tablets, various other gadgets, which we're all taught that if we don't at least get them for ourselves, we're not keeping up with the times. If we don't get them for our kids, we're bad parents. I mean, this is kind of suggested in a very indirect way, to kind of keep up with the Joneses, to really fit in, basically. In the UK, the average child watches at least 10,000 adverts a year. In America, it's more than that. It's 25,000 to 40,000. 15 to 17 billion pounds is spent on adverts aimed at children alone, and 4 billion is spent by fast food companies trying to advertise to the young market. So there are a lot of vested interests involved in ensuring that we keep buying into this stuff. We're consumers, so we're told, which is another word for eaters, and some of the powers that be like to refer to us as useless eaters. So again, it's using our emotions, those positive emotions, the love that we have for our children, and our perceptions of each other as well, against us, and manipulating it in that way. So what we essentially have is a financial war, a spiritual war, as well as the ever-looming threat of a physical one. And for this to be successful, it's necessary to have the collusion and a propaganda campaign actively perpetrated by the media. After all, people can't act against an enemy when they don't know who that enemy is. And so it's through a combination of distraction, misinformation and smear campaigns that the press is not just deceitful, but I would argue downright dangerous in many cases, because not only do people believe what they hear, they act upon it. This is why you get people joining extremist groups. This is why you get sort of people sort of being killed, or like getting into these really sticky situations because they're acting from a point of misinformation. You know, and we're talking about decisions like joining the army, murdering or harassing another, as I say, due to perceived differences, allowing ourselves to continue to be distracted. And in many ways we almost have to be sometimes, because when life kind of grinds you down in a way, when you're kept working in jobs that perhaps you don't like so much, and when you're faced with all this stuff that's coming from all over the place, sometimes we just need that outlet to let go. We need you know, to unwind, and that translates into sitting down in front of the TV where we're kind of being hypnotized in a sense, which is why it was introduced. But most of all, what it kind of almost teaching us, allows us to do, is allows our governments to declare these dangerous wars and normalise it. That's the problem. This is partly why we have so much apathy, because it's kind of normalised. And most of all, refusing to have faith in ourselves, which is what it all comes back down to. I mean, with all that said and done, you know, people often ask me, am I an optimist? Where do I see the future direction of our society going? I mean, people say to me often, well, it's impossible to get enough people to wake up in time and to do something before, I don't know, something terrible happens. I say, no, it isn't. It doesn't take a great deal of people to make changes anyway, because if you think about it, it's the minority of people who are messing things up for the rest of us. It'll only take a minority to reverse that, and that's already underway. I already see that those changes taking place. A little bit slower than personally I'd like, but it's happening, because there are people who are waking up to this stuff. The alternative media, for example, is growing. I mean, there are a lot of journalists out there who do a hell of a lot more of a dangerous job than I do. So it's really about sort of getting that information and keeping that going. For example, even if all of us could only inspire 1 or 2 people into action, or even more importantly, to empower themselves, whether that's spiritually, whether that's physically, whether that's in terms of health or their mentality, then that is 1 or 2 people more than we've got already. So yeah, I'm an optimist. I mean, I'd say like 10 years ago, there were even fewer people who were interested in the alternatives. In years to come, there will be even more if we want it that way. I mean, even when I do go on some of these mainstream sites and I see the reactions to things that we've been told all our lives, I can see more and more of that cynicism coming through. See, I don't think it's about sort of preaching to people or ramming things down other people's throats. No, I see it as inspiring people. I believe we already have the answers, each of us, to most of the solutions that we seek for. We have those solutions at hand. And if we didn't, let's face it, there wouldn't be such a concentrated effort to deceive us all the time. Therefore, as a journalist working for the alternative, no, I don't see things as kind of doom and gloom. I say this, I don't believe in doom and gloom, by the way, because one thing that history has taught us over and over again is that even in the worst case scenario, you know, in terms of sort of war, slavery, genocide, people have always managed to liberate themselves. Not only that, there have always been people who have been altruistic enough to help other people that they don't even know, even if it means giving up their own lives. And that alone, I say, is a reason to be optimistic. My only hope is that freedom and equality for all people living on this planet comes sooner rather than later. So to summarise, my aim is to inform people so that our current struggles may fade sooner than expected. After all, I leave you with a question. Why would you choose to struggle when you don't have to? You see, with the Akashic Times, It's not about giving people all the answers. I don't have all the answers. All I try to do is provoke people and inspire people enough to ask more questions. And so I'll leave it there. But if you want more information, my website is theakashictimes.co.uk. We also have a Twitter and a Facebook group. So that's twitter.com/Akashic Times, and the Facebook is facebook.com/Akashic Times. So if you have access to either, we'd love you to join us. Tell us what you like, tell us what you don't like, and share with us your views and your stories. So if anybody's got any questions, I'll open it up to you.
Can we, sorry, can I just intervene there? Can we just give Janine a round of applause for an excellent work? That was really inspiring, thank you. And what I was going to suggest is that we just take a 10-minute break for the toilet and if anybody wants to drink, and then we come back and do a question and answer session. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, thanks a lot then.
And I need, it's...
Okay, so does anybody...
Andrew, shut your door.
What's your opinion on the Bureau of Investigative Journalists?
See, I read a lot of their stuff. I don't always take it at face value because sometimes I think issues that they could go a little bit deeper in, they don't. But I do think it is a starting point, a good starting point.
Yeah. Are you a member?
No.
Right. They seem to be sort of heading towards the truth, as it were. But as a journalist, I'm not a journalist.
Yeah, see, my take on it is that some of the bigger issues, like for example, ones that are on the screen right now, just kind of get sidelined a little bit. They're very good when it comes to certain conflicts and certain sort of things that are already out there in the public eye and criticising it from a different vantage point. And they do bring out a lot of good research, but I wouldn't trust it 100%.
Yeah, well, it's a bit like the banking system, we've got regulators, we've got the revolving door between the regulators and the actual banking system, financial services, they all work together themselves.
Absolutely.
Are you sort of doing a lot of investigation?
Have I sort of
Investigation of banking?
is the investigation into banking? Oh yeah, a lot. I mean, one of the big stories that I covered fairly recently on the banking institutions is the link between drug money and the banking cartels and how it's all kind of linked. HSBC was one of the banks which
Mexico? Money laundering?
Exposed, and I saw that somebody from the HSBC domain actually clicked on and read that story, which I was quite glad about. But it's not just that bank, it's not just one or two.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about the whole infrastructure.
I'm currently reading a book by Mitch Firestein called Chronic Ponzi, and he sort of is effectively this, and also another one by Nicholas Dunbar, I don't know if you've heard of him, but the wonderful authors, they explain it in more detail about how they actually really invent and charge us. But this Chronic Ponzi, he sort of explains how it was often
Well, that's getting into the mainstream now, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
The whole
Even the mainstream are starting to say, look, these banks can't forever print their own money, invent money.
Yeah, I mean, the mainstream are kind of touching on it from a sort of economic point of view, which is great because, it kind of shakes people out of their slumber a bit. But in terms of the criminal history of the banks and how they really control the system to the extent that they do, that's unsurprisingly not covered in the mainstream.
So what help are you looking for with
Basically, all I'm trying to do is get it out there to as many people as possible. because obviously I have this information and I'm putting it out there, but the more people that kind of sort of get on board with it, you know, sort of give us their viewpoints, the better really. So I really come from that point of view.
How many readers have you got? Do you know?
I'm not too sure in terms of a precise number, but in terms of the people that I get daily, it's usually between about 50 to 70 people a day from different places in the world. Like, my main readership is in the UK, the second biggest readership is in the USA.
Do you sort of do these marketing techniques?
Yeah, absolutely. I do it sort of mainly over social media networks and also content sharing sites.
Have you sort of what's the word
Alex, yeah. I'm a bit iffy on Alex Jones, if I'm perfectly honest.
Position.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh yeah, that ridiculous interview. I mean, I think it was deliberate, to be honest. I mean, what better way to make the alternative look stupid?
Are you looking for anybody to provide content to those?
Oh yeah, I mean, I look for people to provide content all the time. I mean, in the absence of that, I just do it myself. But I do have some people who contribute, but we're always open to more.
Have you come across positive money?
Huh?
Have you come across positive money?
Positive money? No, I've not come across that.
Well, they explain, they provide some good evidence as to how money is actually really it's evidence that from people like former deputy government brought up.
Okay.
One of the current directors of the board of their term will actually say they create deposits and they expect both sides of the balance sheet, some sectors but they're actually, they've got a week coming they're releasing a film at Leeds University later this month actually.
I get what you're saying.
What?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you at the back there. But I mean, that's the great the thing about these meetings. You know, people always say, "Have you heard of this? Have you heard of that?" And sometimes I haven't always.
Yeah.
So it's a good way of sharing information and linking up with different groups who are kind of fighting the same battle. I mean, that's what this is all about. You know,
Positive money are working towards their lobbying, they contact MPs and so on. They are actually starting to work their way into the mainstream media, explaining how it really is just lobbying out of the number, usually to our detriment, to our disadvantage. As I say, there is
Okay.
There was a Conservative MP on RT the other day, openly saying he knows, he's aware of where the money comes from, what the banks do.
Yeah. Oh, I certainly will do, because
I think they are good.
well,
Yeah, but you don't often see him saying so on TV.
Well, that Mitchell guy is
But I'd say that, I mean, the more that they're sort of coming down on us economically, is the more that this kind of stuff is coming out, because unfortunately sometimes it takes a big financial disaster and sometimes it's the only thing that will wake people up, because that's something that we can identify with straight away, it's something that affects us immediately in the here and now. So I do think we'll start to see more of this stuff.
There's a financial paper got a DVD going about at the moment. Britain bankruptcy.
on YouTube called Money as Debt that explains everything really simply. A Goldsmith's Tale, that's 7 minutes long. But if you want the full version, the Money is Debt. It's on YouTube. It's Paul Green.
It's about
Paul Green.
Another good one is The Secret History of the Credit Card, which explains exactly how people are trapped in a cycle of debt. And that's more of a... Huh?
It's really bad, it's that bad.
Well, like the vast majority of people are. But it explains how they do it.
Can I ask a question, sorry? What can we do on a personal level to raise awareness of the sort of things that he's mentioned?
Holding discussions, sort of sharing sort of the news that you do find. I mean, this is really how it's done. This is how I'd argue it's spread, by holding these discussions, not just with like sort of preaching to the converted or talking to people who already know about this stuff, but you know, sort of holding events like this and putting these events out in the public, because I think, yeah, at first you might get laughed at. At first people might say, you know what, I'm not interested in that. But people said that 10 years ago, and I'd say we've come a long way since then. And also, although I'm not a big fan of the political system at all, I do still think that we can use it collectively to our advantage by putting pressure on our sort of local representatives. Because if we don't do that, that's the reason why they've got as much power as they have. So, I mean, I come at this from a lot of different angles. I don't think there's just one way in which we can sort of combat all the problems that we see today. I think there are a multitude of different ways on different areas of our lives which affect us all equally. So it's about kind of drawing all that together, working with groups that are also fighting for the same things, but at the same time not being tied down too much to the group mentality, also retaining that individuality and going out and finding your own truth.
One way or another, we need to start, taking action as well, doing something positive.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're right.
It's not easy to do, certainly when you're on your own.
First meeting I went, somebody mentioned leafleting. I've not heard anything. So I thought we were saving up to get some leaflets done.
We've got a few here, so if anybody wants it, take some photocopy of the road. It's just...
Well, we're not doing that now. We're not doing that now. Then.
When? Yes, we are. We're going to design some new
there has been
leaflets
some
soon.
discussion about designing some new leaflets,
That was in
but there are a few
September.
old ones around that we can. They're still relevant and valid. So
how do you see the next year panning out for you and your new? Is it just a paper that's online?
It's just online at the moment, although I am planning to get it into print sort of when I get to that point. But over the next year, I plan for it to grow. I plan to sort of put more stuff out there, do more talks like this, gather, join different groups and really kind of get the message out there, as well as working with other people who are doing the same thing, because I believe that it's not just about, okay, I've got this blog here, I've got this newspaper here. No, it's about coming together collectively and sort of singing from the same hymn sheet.
So how is it financed?
Self-financed. I get absolutely no money from it whatsoever. It's expensive, I think, but it's
You have a
worth
donate
it.
button on your site.
Yeah, I do. So any donations will be welcome.
There you go. Tell you what, I'll set them up for you like up there.
Do you mind if we take some advertisement or something? Obviously, it's going to be very difficult for you. Obviously, you kind of try to compete people like 56% of media and so on. So that is almost like a really, really big challenge taking. I'm so proud of you as well for doing this.
Thank you.
But why don't you take some advertisement and just go to local and try that?
See, it's extremely precarious for me because with advertising, that's kind of how the control comes in. Now, there are sort of organisations out there that are really good at funding alternative media. I mean, there's so many of them out there, but unfortunately, the majority of the ones I have immediate access to, they just tend to be sort of mainstream businesses. It is something I'm looking at, but I mean, at the end of the day, it could only be businesses and companies or organisations that will not compromise the editorial aspect, because that's kind of how a lot of newspapers that we see today end up not being so independent.
Any more questions, anybody?
I just
Spread the love.
Yeah, absolutely.
Spread the love as
Absolutely.
well. It's a beautiful world. Fantastic, beautiful people. All here today, all united.
Can
all
I-
wanting the same thing.
Yeah.
This guy here, Ben, as well. We love to feel the air.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I just mention? I don't know if anyone saw. Please. I just happened to be in the library yesterday on. I can't remember what I was on, but I just happened to come across this YouTube video, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's only a few minutes long, and basically what it's about is these protesters in Ukraine. They held mirrors up to the police that were in the line in front of them. And it's so powerful because it shows this policeman in all his riot gear, hard helmet and everything. And the look on his face is like just self-hatred. It's like, what have I become? You know, and by holding, the protesters who were in the front line, by holding the mirrors up, like, all they were doing completely non-violent, just something as simple as holding a mirror, they were forced to look at themselves. You know, and it's without saying anything at all, you're making them look at themselves and say, shit, what have I become? You know, is this really what I want for my children, my grandchildren? And it almost brought me to tears because it's just so powerful, and I just thought, that's amazing. You know, we've got more people. And the guy who was on the video said, you know, I really hope this spreads. I hope more people do this. It sounds really simple, and some people might laugh possibly, but it's just really powerful when you think about it. The look on this policeman's face, it was, you know, like, oh, don't show that to me. I don't want to see my reflection. I don't want to see what I've become. But it was really good, you know. I'm really pleased that I came across it.
You'd be surprised how powerful that is. I heard of something fairly similar in Sydney, where they held a meeting for prison officers, including a lot of the ones who were accused of really being violent towards some of the women under their care. And they just kind of did this short play, this was by ex-prisoners, showing the kind of things that they went through at the hands of these prison officers. And the reaction from the audience, i.e. the people who were kind of causing the problems, was very powerful. A lot of them sort of just cried. And there were some who said, oh, we don't do that, kind of in denial, but still very shocked at what they saw. You know, having a reflection of yourself and seeing yourself the way you act on a daily basis, it can be very, very powerful.
It's like when they've got those uniforms on, it's like they become a different person with a different mentality. And then as soon as the uniforms are gone, on the whole, not in, you know, there are a few exceptions, as we know. There are other ways that these guys are controlled. They're just human beings who've got families. You know, they've got children, grandchildren, you know, mothers. You know.
Just following orders. Well, we had that before.
Yeah.
But that's mind control. That's mind
I
control.
used to
It's
work in
programming.
Germany, and
Just,
I used to work in Germany, and I watched a documentary once on German television about a guy. He was a journalist himself, and he investigated a farmer. He was in there, a farmer who worked in Dachau concentration camp. He used to go to work in more gas tubes, and then come home in the evening when he was a working farmer. So he could somehow live with himself, because of the propaganda, essentially. I would say that you were talking about earlier on, the indoctrination, you know, and also following orders. And people will follow orders to the nth degree.
Yeah, I saw that one, but at the same time, we also believed that the Jews were getting in the way of the Germans and they had to go. So he had a belief in getting rid of them anyway.
Yeah,
That's why they
Yeah.
make a Poland.
The problem is they fall into a mortgage trap, you see. They join with good intentions, whatever they join, police service, fire service, prison service, they join with good intentions to get a mortgage round the neck.
Does anybody
And
know
that's
where
it,
they
the stuff.
originate from?
What? What?
We've got a question. Yeah, we've got a question.
Okay.
Well, I'm Turkish, I mean, you know, Johnny, and I'm from Istanbul, and it's from Beşiktaş as well. And we've got 6 people being killed last year from police, by police officers. Our government is basically is a secular religious government, but the president is Jewish guy, and his surname it's been looked into, is proper Jewish, and his mum and dad is coming from the background, is Jewish background and everything. But his promoting is extremist Muslim party, basically using the religion. And the people more religious they get, basically more thicker they get as well. So that's affecting people's minds. They don't want people to be educated. They don't want people to be talking to each other. They don't want this kind of groups. They just want people to read the magazines and concentrate on their images and stay within the images and basically pray for the box of hair colorings and lipsticks.
Sounds very much like over here.
Promote the beauty. And what they do is they do photoshops, and they want believe into photoshops. That's what they're doing. And we're actually living in Istanbul. This my two brothers being pepper gassed. And in fact, they were just having a laugh about it. If you're not being pepper gassed, you're not Turkish. It is really bad, and it's coming to England as well. I mean, at the moment, all the private station is nurses, and NHS going to be probably going to get into the privatization. Sorry, I'm Turkish and I'm really double point sometimes. So, and this is happening in England as well, but it is in a slow process. Murdoch is saying, what's wrong with you? Don't you like page 3 anymore?
Never liked it to begin with, personally, but...
Exactly, because we're not having a page 3 anymore, because we don't want to read that. And it's getting more and more people waking up by other people, because I'm not expecting what you're selling to me, just saying that to people. But we are buying it. As long as the people buying it, they're selling it. And what you're doing is really good, and I'm going to look into it in the internet, but I really want you to promote it and get the organic shops, maybe, you know, just take some advertisement, go around. If I can help you, I'll try to help you as much as I could. But you need to do that, because otherwise it's going to be very, very difficult for it to survive, because these people are incredibly big. Like Topshop and Murdoch, I mean, they don't even live in this country. They just get one-bedroom studio apartment near France in that country. I can't even remember what's the country called.
England.
Is it Monte Carlo? Yeah, they just get like a little studio apartment. They don't even go there. But if they've got a one-bedroom studio apartment, they don't pay tax. Topshop, Murdoch, they don't pay flipping tax. But they own everything.
Yeah, completely.
VHS doesn't pay tax. Topshop doesn't pay tax. Sun newspaper doesn't pay tax.
No, tax is just for Ireland.
I'm trying not to pay tax. That's the worst thing you can do is pay tax. You don't pay
Yes,
tax.
but they want us to pay tax.
Well, I try my utmost
They
to
want
pay
us to
tax.
pay tax. But the person is 1,000 million times bigger than me. He doesn't pay tax, but he wants me to pay tax. But I have to, because if I don't, I go to prison. I have to pay what I do.
See, well, what people... Let me just...
Please. Hi guys.
Are there any more questions for Anybody else like to ask a question of
Anyone?
You're doing a good job, Janine.
Thank you, Judy. Fantastic.
Thank you for writing it.
So, information. I'm sure that we've all taken a lot from everything that you've brought tonight. So thank you very much indeed. Can we just thank Janine again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
9% to be at each other's throats, or even more crucially, to act against their own self-interest, i.e. by voting for restrictions on financial safety nets and turning a blind eye to political injustice. And I think it's the great Martin Luther King that once said, A threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And as we see our civil liberties slowly being confined to the historical dustbin, if we allow it, then unfortunately we are experiencing the receiving end of that wisdom. Now, I don't see that it has to be that way. I see that it's definitely sort of time to stand up and fight, even if it just means getting back your self-empowerment, shall I say. So I decided to start the first stages of that fight back, not just for my future, but if I decide to have any children, their future as well, and by starting up the Akashic Times, along with many other things. But this is one of the main ways that I tried to get the information out there. And I believe that as the years go on, this will only get bigger. I mean, we're already seeing the rise of the alternative media. So my aim at the Akashic Times is simply to fill a gap within the media. I mean, at the moment, I'd say that our collective media agencies, both nationally and internationally, is a laughing stock. It's a joke. And unfortunately, the joke's on us. You see, if you were a regular consumer of the rubbish that passes for the mainstream news, which I doubt many people in here are, but for those that are, they can almost be forgiven for thinking that people are just helpless souls that, really need the strong arm of the law and the government to, tell us what to do and to protect us, as they're always claiming. You could almost be forgiven for believing most of the pervading populist ideas swept under the carpet. And
Sorry about this.
yeah, then you realise why scandals are routinely aren't examined in detail. I'd say you hear of them, but they're kind of brushed aside after a while. Or why editors of national newspapers, I won't name any names, i.e. the Daily Mail, for example, are allowed to sit on the board of the Press Complaints Commission, which is a clear conflict of interest. It explains basically why you can never really trust what you read in the papers. I mean, why is it that we get a situation where the antics of Miley Cyrus or Justin Bieber or whatever celebrity you can sort of pull out of a hat makes the front page news, while the content of the Bilderberg meetings and sort of elite paedophile rings, which is just only starting to gather pace in terms of exposure, barely get a look in by the mainstream media. You see, I never really understood this in as much detail until recently, fairly recently I would say, because we're often led to believe that when you start exploring these things, it's just a wild conspiracy theory, until you start researching for yourself and you find out that actually there's a lot of truth to it. As I say, I was very naive before I became a journalist. I just believed that the media, they're really the watchdogs of society. Especially the British media, it's kind of held up as this bastion of truth and a kind of neutral voice. If something goes wrong in politics, if something goes wrong with the police force, then at least you've got a voice, then at least you can expose this. And what I found out is that really does not reflect reality. You see, the media is just another system, and like all of the other systems that we have, like the police force, politics, the banking institutions, it's one that serves the 1% and encourages the other 90. We'd be told, you've got to find us a front page, you've got to find us a front page, It worked under this kind of target system. So I thought this would make a brilliant splash, and I spent 6 months on the job investigating the story. Putting in various Freedom of Information Acts, getting people to trust me, getting people to talk, and examining the evidence for myself. And after 6 months, I had a pretty good story together. This is something that could not only have really caused debate in Telford, but beyond that as well, nationally. Only to be called into the editor's office, not the editor of the paper I was on, the editor of the overall group, to be told, we really love your skills as a journalist. You've really, come into your own, and we're impressed with your progress. unfortunately we won't be publishing this story. And when I asked why, I was told, well, the mayor, his businesses, it's one of our biggest advertisers, and we'd lose a lot of political contacts. Needless to say, I wasn't very happy with that outcome, and it prompted me to do more research into the ownership of the media and later on the Masons, because what I couldn't understand is, okay, yes, I get how one group of papers can be influenced to such an extent on a local level. What I didn't really get is some of the other papers, our competition who I tried to flog the story to, didn't seem to be that interested either, and they all kind of gave similar reasons if they came back to me at all. And essentially what I discovered is we have a really big problem on our hands with the media, not just in this country, but all over the world. You see, when you have a situation where the likes of Barclays Bank, Rupert Murdoch and ex-KGB agents have ownership of the media, then you realise why scandals such as the Leveson inquiry are routinely...
Okay, thank you. Welcome to the first We Are Change Leeds meeting of 2014. We're very happy to have Janine Griffiths, who's going to give the talk this evening. Just to tell you a little bit about Janine, she is an investigative journalist who has worked in the industry for over 8 years now. She started out as a newspaper reporter in the West Midlands before finally moving to Leeds to work on behalf of a financial news agency. She's also worked on short projects for The Guardian during her career. Shortly after moving to Leeds in 2009, due to her disillusionment over the quality of journalism and the mainstream media, she started up the Akashic Times. Janine has witnessed firsthand the corruption with the mainstream media and how facts, statistics and situations are manipulated in order to play into the hands of the corporate entities and political sellouts that have a vested interest in maintaining and expanding the status quo. The frustration of having stories censored and witnessing the shady dealings with both the local and national media led her to finally's decision to start up the Akashic Times. Please give Janine a round of applause.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Carol for that wonderful introduction. Okay, so tonight I'm just going to talk a little bit about who I am, why I started out the Akashic Times, and just give a bit of an insight into my background as a reporter. But first, before I begin, can I just check, can everyone hear me at the back?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so I first became a journalist because I like to write, and also I was very frustrated at the censorship and lies that passes for news nowadays. So as mentioned, I've been in the industry for around about 8 years now, and from a very early age, I mean even before I became a reporter, it became clear to me how the media could divide people and cause tension in society. I mean, I grew up in a place called Dagenham, and I'd often hear a lot of my friends and a lot of the people I knew sort of talk in a very sort of negative way about communities that they weren't familiar with, and immigrants in particular. And when I ask people, okay, well, why do you think that? Where do you get these views from? Often I'd hear people say, well, you know, I mean, it's all over the news, it's all in the newspapers, or sometimes, oh, well, it's just, you know, I was brought up to think like this. So we can really see how the media can influence whole generations of people. However, I was naive enough to think that, okay, well, you know, I see the problems with the mainstream media, but how do we sort of change this? How you can change it from the inside, because that's what people do, isn't it? You know, like they see a problem and they work with it to get it changed. Well, I had my first taste of reality when I worked for the Shropshire Star Group, and I was working on a paper called the Telford Journal. The mayor's wife had approached our paper basically with evidence that he was not only pilfering money from public funds and siphoning it off into his own business, he'd also been quite violent towards her. There was a lot of domestic violence going on. Now, I was one of 2 reporters working on the Telford Journal, which is part of the Shropshire Star, and I was the one who picked up the story. Just to give you a bit of background into how it all worked, on the Telford Journal we were always under pressure to come up with front page stories. Every single